Jake Lawson had always dreamed of returning to the land where he grew up. After years of working in the fast-paced tech world and watching city life erode his peace of mind, he finally took a break and returned to his roots, a 100-acre ranch in rural Texas that had belonged to his grandfather. The property, passed down through generations, sat untouched for nearly a decade after his grandfather passed, and Jake had finally made time to restore and reconnect with it. At the heart of the property was a serene lake surrounded by tall oaks and a soft breeze that rustled through the brush like a whisper from the past. It was exactly what Jake needed. He decided to camp there for a week, away from cell signals and city chaos, to clear his mind. He brought a modest setup, tent, firewood, some fishing gear, a cooler full of supplies, and an old journal where he planned to sketch and reflect. He set up by the northern bank of the lake, under a patch of shade, and sat there for hours watching the water shimmer under the sun. For Jake, this wasn't just a camping trip. It was homecoming. Every smell, every sound was familiar, grounding. He had no reason to expect anything but peace. But the world around the ranch had changed. The nearby town had grown significantly over the last 5 years, and new suburban developments had crept toward the outer perimeter of Jake's land. A freshly built gated community, Oak Glen Meadows, now bordered the south side of his ranch. With it came manicured lawns, identical stucco homes, and an overly enthusiastic homeowners association. Jake had heard stories about HOAs and their absurd levels of control, but he had no clue how close they'd gotten or how bold they'd become. On his second day at the lake, Jake noticed a family walking along the southern shoreline with dogs and picnic baskets. He was confused at first, but waved politely. The family waved back and said, "Beautiful HOA lake you've got here." That didn't sit right. He didn't say anything in the moment, chalking it up to a misunderstanding. But that night, as he sat beside the fire with a mug of coffee, and the stars overhead, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, coming down the gravel path he had just cleared last week. A black SUV rolled up slowly and stopped a few feet from his tent. Out stepped 2 uniformed security guards with Oak Glen Meadows security stitched onto their sleeves. Behind them, a sheriff's cruiser pulled in, and an officer stepped out with a notepad in hand. Jake stood up calmly, unsure of what was happening. "Sir," one of the guards began, "we've received reports of a trespasser at the HOA lake." Jake blinked. "This isn't an HOA lake. This is my private property." The officer glanced at him skeptical. "Do you have proof of that, sir?" Jake nodded and retrieved his land deed and property map from the glove box of his truck, parked nearby. As they reviewed the documents, a woman stormed onto the scene in heels and a blazer. Dana Whitmore, the HOA president. She didn't bother with introductions. "This is community land," she snapped. "That lake has been open to our residents for 2 years. You can't just show up and pitch a tent here." Jake's confusion turned to disbelief. "This land's been in my family for generations. I have every legal right to be here." Dana shook her head dismissively. "That's not what our maps say." Jake was stunned. The cop gave a half-hearted warning and said the matter would be reviewed, but Jake could feel the storm brewing. Something didn't add up. He wasn't just dealing with overzealous neighbors. He was up against something bigger. And as the SUV and cruiser rolled away, Jake stood there in the firelight, gripping the deed in his hand, determined to find out just how deep the trespass went. The next morning, Jake woke early with the uneasy feeling that the previous night's confrontation was more than just a misunderstanding. Something about the way Dana Whitmore had spoken, with entitlement, not uncertainty, kept replaying in his mind. She wasn't guessing. She believed with full confidence that the lake was part of her HOA's territory. Jake had grown up on this land. He knew every boundary marker, every fence post his grandfather had installed. The idea that someone could suddenly lay claim to it was absurd, but the seriousness in the officer's tone told him he couldn't dismiss this as a fluke. Later that afternoon, Jake drove down to the edge of his property near the new development, wanting to see it for himself. He was stunned at how close the subdivision had grown. Rows of identical homes lined a manicured street that ended right at the tree line of his ranch. A paved walking trail meandered dangerously close to his side of the lake. Then he saw it. 2 benches, a wooden dock, and a sign that read, Oak Glen Meadows Lakefront Area, for residents only. Jake's jaw clenched. His lake had been turned into an HOA amenity. There was no mistaking it. A small kayak was tied up at the dock. Children's toys lay scattered nearby, and a gravel trail had clearly been cut through his land. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was trespassing, organized and ongoing. Jake walked back up the trail to where the subdivision fence should have stopped. He saw where the old wire fence had once been, but it had been torn down and removed. Someone had made sure there were no visual boundaries left. The HOA had absorbed his land like a parasite. He returned to his camp and pulled out a binder with all his land records, surveys, deeds, maps. He cross-checked the original survey lines with GPS coordinates on his phone. Everything confirmed it. The lake, the dock, the benches, they were all on his property. He took photos of everything and labeled the coordinates. He didn't want emotion clouding the facts. What mattered now was proof. That evening, Jake sat by the fire again, this time without peace. The stars above seemed colder now. He was still trying to understand how something like this could even happen. Could people really be so arrogant as to just help themselves to someone else's land? Or was this a bigger con? Something carefully planned? Just as he was losing himself in thought, a flashlight beam danced through the woods. Voices approached. Jake stood up, heart pounding. A trio of men appeared, one wearing a reflective vest, the others in casual clothes. They stopped, just short of his camp. "You're the guy who pitched a tent by the lake?" one asked. "I own this land," Jake responded flatly. The man in the vest stepped forward. "We're with the HOA. We're going to need you to pack up and leave. This area is designated as a protected nature zone for residents. You're breaking several HOA ordinances." Jake stared at them, deadpan. "Your ordinances don't apply here. This is private ranch land. I've got the papers to prove it," the man smirked. "Then you better take it up with the board. If you're still here tomorrow, we'll escalate." Jake didn't say a word. He simply watched them turn around and disappear into the trees. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't ignorance anymore. It was a threat. Back in his truck, Jake opened his laptop and began drafting an email to a lawyer he knew from Austin. He attached pictures, documents, and a detailed explanation. He wasn't going to let this slide. They had declared war on his land, and now he was going to fight back, legally, thoroughly, and without hesitation. Jake didn't waste a single day. The morning after the threat from the HOA reps, he drove into town with a folder full of documents and a growing storm inside him. What had begun as a peaceful retreat to his family's ranch had turned into something darker, something that reeked of entitlement and fraud. He wasn't just angry. He was determined to understand how this had happened and who was behind it. His first stop was the county assessor's office. Jake explained the situation to a clerk who, at first, seemed indifferent, until he mentioned that an HOA had built a dock, trail, and park area on his land without permission. That caught her attention. She pulled up the parcel maps, scanned the official records, and printed out several documents. One map in particular made Jake's blood run cold. There it was. His lake, his dock, even part of the surrounding field, labeled in digital records as Community Lake Access, Oak Glen. Meadows HOA. Jake held the paper in disbelief. This wasn't just a neighborhood rumor or some overreach. The records had been altered. Somehow, somewhere along the line, someone had changed public property databases to make it appear like the lake wasn't his anymore. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. The clerk leaned over. "You're the listed owner in the deed. Records. That map must be wrong. You'll want to talk to the zoning office and possibly the recorder's department. If this is a case of document fraud, it's serious." Jake thanked her and headed across the hall to zoning. There, a more experienced official named Harold reviewed the same documents and frowned. "This is definitely a problem. That land's never been subdivided, no easements, no transfer. You're still the legal owner, no question." "So how—" "Did their HOA map get into the system?" Jake asked. Harold hesitated. "Someone likely submitted it during one of the subdivision phases. If no one objected and it wasn't flagged, it could have been accepted into the county database by mistake or manipulation." That word, manipulation, hung in the air. Jake requested certified copies of his original deeds and survey records. He wasn't leaving any room for argument. Next, he drove to his lawyer's office in Austin, a real estate litigator named Lauren Chan, who had handled land disputes for a decade. After a couple of hours reviewing the material, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This isn't just trespass. This is misrepresentation, fraudulent land use, and if that HOA sold homes claiming lake access, this could blow wide open." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Sold homes claiming lake access?" Lauren nodded. "If they advertised your lake as a community feature, buyers might have paid a premium. That's real estate fraud." Jake sat still for a moment, letting the pieces fall into place. This wasn't just Dana being overbearing. This was a scam. The HOA had used his property to inflate the value of their homes. They'd advertised access they didn't have, possibly collected dues to maintain features they didn't own, and bullied the rightful owner into silence. "I want to go all the way with this," he said firmly. "No warnings, no negotiations." Lauren smiled. "Good. First step is a formal cease and desist. Then we go after them for damages and fraud." Over the next few days, Jake collected everything he needed: photo evidence, time-stamped GPS data, testimonies from old neighbors, even drone footage showing how the HOA had landscaped and developed areas deep into his land. With each new piece, the case became stronger. It wasn't just about reclaiming his lake anymore. It was about holding these people accountable for what they'd done, because they had crossed a line, and Jake was ready to push back harder than they ever expected. Jake spent the next week transforming his peaceful retreat into a war room. Gone were the fishing poles and sketchbooks, now replaced with motion sensor cameras, legal notices, and boundary markers. Every inch of his lakeside property was carefully documented and reinforced. He hired a local land surveyor to walk the entire perimeter with him, planting flags and stakes where the original fence line had once stood. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA hadn't just accidentally encroached on his land. They had systematically expanded into it, assuming no one would ever challenge them. With Lauren's help, Jake filed the formal cease and desist order and sent it to the Oak Glen Meadows HOA board, including Dana Whitmore. Within 48 hours, there was a response, an official letter from the HOA's attorney denying all wrongdoing and threatening countersuits for defamation, obstruction, and public harassment. The letter accused Jake of being a troublemaker, a recluse trying to interfere with the rights of the residents. Jake couldn't believe the audacity. He forwarded the letter to Lauren, who laughed when she read it. "They're posturing," she said. "They know they're in trouble. We'll escalate." So they did. Lauren filed suit in county court, naming the HOA, Dana Whitmore, and several board members personally. The charges included civil trespass, willful destruction of property, fraud, and unlawful enrichment. At the same time, Jake shared his story with a local news outlet, which published a piece titled "Homeowners Association Accused of Seizing Private Land for Lake Access." The article spread quickly on social media. Comments flooded in, some from former residents who'd been pressured by Dana's leadership, others from potential buyers who were shocked to learn their promised community lake wasn't legally accessible at all. Within days, HOA board meetings turned into chaos. Residents demanded answers. Some threatened to sue the HOA themselves, angry that their home values might be affected. The board tried to spin it as a property boundary confusion, but the pressure mounted. Then came the court date for the injunction. Jake stood calmly in the courtroom while Lauren presented the documentation. Land surveys, satellite imagery, records of physical improvements built by the HOA on Jake's land, marketing flyers advertising exclusive lake access, and sworn affidavits from neighbors. The judge didn't need long. He granted the injunction on the spot. Effective immediately, the Oak Glen Meadows HOA was barred from using, maintaining, or promoting the lake or any portion of Jake's property. They were ordered to remove all constructed features, benches, docks, trails, within 30 days. Violations would carry steep daily fines. The judge also scheduled a damages hearing for the following month, leaving the HOA on the hook for potential financial liability that could bankrupt them. Jake didn't celebrate, at least not publicly. He returned to his lake that evening and stood on the dock watching the sun dip behind the trees. For the first time in weeks, the water was quiet. No kids, no barking dogs, no strangers claiming ownership. Just him and the land that had always been his. But he knew this wasn't over. The board hadn't accepted defeat yet. That much was obvious the next day, when a new private property dispute sign was nailed to a tree near the development's entrance, with Dana's signature at the bottom. She was trying to save face, casting him as the villain to her community. Jake didn't care. The law was on his side now, and unlike them, he had nothing to hide. As he packed up his legal documents and prepared for the damages trial, Jake made one thing clear to Lauren: he wanted more than just restitution. He wanted the HOA dismantled. They had crossed onto his land and into his life, and now he was going to make sure they paid for it in full. The sun rose gently over the lake as Jake watched the fog lift off the water like a curtain revealing the final act. 30 days had passed since the judge's order, and the deadline for the HOA to vacate and dismantle all unauthorized structures had arrived. But Jake didn't need to wait for a calendar reminder. He had been monitoring the site daily, documenting every movement, or lack thereof. The HOA had done little. The dock still sat on his shoreline, the benches remained untouched, and the trail leading from the neighborhood was still worn down from foot traffic. It was clear they were ignoring the court order. Jake made the call to the county sheriff's office at 9 a.m. sharp. He provided the injunction number, the photographs, and the judge's written directive. By noon, 2 deputies and a work crew arrived at the edge of the lake. Jake stood by, calm and composed, as the sheriff's team began the process of eviction, not of people, but of structures and illegal claims. The HOA lake access sign was yanked from the ground. The dock was unbolted, the trail was cordoned off with orange fencing, and every last bench was loaded onto a flatbed truck. Within a few hours, years of encroachment were erased. The land finally looked like it had before, private, peaceful, and untouched by suburban greed. That afternoon, Jake and his lawyer stood before the judge again for the damages hearing. Lauren presented the costs of the surveyors, attorneys, fencing, lost use, and property depreciation. She also added a claim for punitive damages, citing the HOA's blatant refusal to comply with the court's directive and their continued marketing of the lake even after the order. The judge, clearly irritated by the HOA's behavior, awarded Jake full damages, plus an additional $50,000 in punitive fines. The HOA was ordered to pay immediately or risk asset seizure. But that wasn't the end. Word had spread. Several homeowners from Oak Glen Meadows had already filed lawsuits against the HOA board, claiming they were misled into buying homes with promised lake access that never legally existed. Real estate agents began distancing themselves from the subdivision. Buyers canceled offers. A few bold residents even placed fraudulent HOA signs in their yards, drawing more attention. Under mounting legal pressure, and with dwindling funds, the HOA began to unravel. Dana Whitmore, once the proud and combative president, abruptly resigned. 3 board members followed within the week. The organization couldn't meet its financial obligations, and soon after, a court-appointed trustee recommended the HOA be dissolved. By the end of the month, Oak Glen Meadows no longer had an operating association. What had once been a tight-fisted regime collapsed under the weight of its arrogance. Jake didn't attend their final board meeting. He didn't need to. Justice had done its work. Instead, he focused on reclaiming what was rightfully his. He hired a local contractor to restore the lakefront, clearing out leftover debris, reseeding native grasses, and putting up new signage. Private property, Lawson Ranch. He also added another layer of fencing and motion-activated lighting. But this time, the intention wasn't just defense, it was vision. With Lauren's encouragement, Jake filed permits to build a series of small eco-cabins near the lake. He'd open the property to vetted guests, fellow nature lovers, artists, and those seeking retreat from the same chaotic world he had once run from. He wasn't just protecting his land now. He was using it, on his terms, for his future. What started as a quiet camping trip had become a full-scale legal battle, and Jake had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. He had learned that even in a world of contracts, bureaucracy, and false claims, the truth still mattered. And as he stood once again at the water's edge, watching the sunset reflect across the ripples, he knew one thing for certain: they would never steal a single inch from him again.